Good morning, everybody. Today is Friday, so we'll have our Friday speech. Today's Friday speech is really two stories. I owe you a couple because we didn't have one last Friday. But we'll have a couple today to make up for it. So I'm drinking my coffee still every day. You still don't know what's in here, but it's still just coffee. All right, so the first story is about a dude named EJ. EJ was actually from St. Louis. He lived in St. Louis. A super wealthy businessman. Did really well for himself. He's married. He had three kids. One of them was a boy, and then two girls. So he was super wealthy. Did great in St. Louis. He was crushing it. And in the 1920s, he saw a lot of business opportunities because of our booming economy and because of the things that were going on in the Roaring '20s. So he left St. Louis. He still lived in St. Louis, but he moved to Chicago for business, so he'd be there for a few days and then come back home. And in Chicago, he started to build dog tracks for dog racing and gambling. Well, of course, if you're going to be involved in gambling in Chicago in the 1920s, you're going to come in contact with Al Capone. So he did. He actually partnered with Al Capone, and they partnered on some dog tracks, and they were super successful and made all kinds of money. And the dad brought that money back with him to St. Louis, and his family really did well. Well, his son, in the meantime, and his daughters were growing up, and they kind of questioned him a little bit, like, "Hey, Dad, you're a real good person. You teach us to do the right thing all the time, but then here you are working with Al Capone. That's probably not real good." And the dad was cool about it and told the kids that it would be okay and it wasn't that big of a deal. So the son, though, was a little bit mischievous. He was kind of lazy, the dad thought. But the dad spent a lot of time with him, like trained him how to use his gun. And so they did a lot of hunting together, and the kid became a really good shot because the dad kind of taught him that. But dad thought he wasn't doing well enough in school, so he sent him to a place called the Western Military Academy, which is actually in Alton, Illinois. Not really as a punishment, but as a way to try to right the ship a little bit and try to make him do things a little bit better. So Dad continued with his business dealings in Chicago, and he'd travel up there every once in a while and deal with Capone. But he and Capone started to have disagreements about the books and what they were going to turn in and what they didn't report, because Capone, of course, did not want any of this going to the federal government. And the dad kind of felt the pressure from the kids a little bit because they were on his case about doing the right thing. So after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, EJ had enough. The businessman had enough of Capone and started to really mull this over. And so the following year made a decision that he was going to turn in the books to the IRS. So he set up a meeting actually in St. Louis at the Missouri Athletic Club, which is in downtown St. Louis. It's right across the Eads Bridge. Still there, it's still in operation. He had a meeting there, and they set him up with the IRS, and he turned over the three little black ledgers. If you remember that, we talked about that during the Capone movie in the 1920s unit. So he turned over those ledgers. As a result of those ledgers, they were able to convict Al Capone for tax evasion. And so Capone went to Alcatraz in 1933, and EJ ultimately did the right thing. He stood up for what he believed in, and he did the right thing, and his kids saw him do the right thing, and so they were happy with him, even though his kids were much older by that point. So the years go on, right? In 1939, so this is like 8 years after he turned him in, 6 years after Capone went to prison, the dad is on his way home from the grocery store in St. Louis, and he gets to a stoplight, and somebody pulls up at the stoplight. Two guys in the car next to him open fire on him and kill him at point blank range. And there's never a trial, there's never a conviction, there's nothing. Everybody knows what happened, even though it's been a while. And we've been through the Great Depression, we've gone through all this. And so, but those guys were loyal to Capone, and they didn't forget that somebody had snitched. And so they went after him and they killed him. And so those kids saw that lesson, that the dad paid the ultimate sacrifice for doing this. But he stood up, the dad did. EJ stood up for what he believed in, and he did the right thing. And so that's a tough lesson, but it's pretty cool, right? He did the right thing. He helped bring down Al Capone. And so that's your first story, right, for doing the right thing. So the second story involves a guy named Butch, who was a pilot during World War II, and he was on USS Lexington in the South Pacific, and while he was on the USS Lexington, they were attacked by what they called Japanese Betties. Those Betties, that was a nickname that the Americans gave to the planes. They were coming in, and they knew they were coming in, and so they tried to scramble as many planes up as they could. Some of the initial planes that got up were shot down by those Betties, far away from the ship itself. And there were 2 planes remaining, and they were still kind of waiting for the other guys to scramble. So Butch was one of those 2 planes that was still remaining, and he and his co-pilot, they looked at each other and wanted to test their guns to make sure they were working, so they just did a little bit, and Butch's guns worked just fine, but his co-pilot did not, so he had to turn around and go back. Okay, so that meant Butch was by himself, and all these Japanese planes were flying in. So he's got a decision to make there. And so what does he do? Does he fight these guys by himself? Or does he just turn? He could have flown off and landed on a deserted island somewhere in the middle of the Pacific and lived and been okay. But he didn't do that because he knew that all the guys on the USS Lexington were depending on him. So what he does is he goes to fight these guys on his own. He doesn't take out the entire squadron, but he does enough to stall these guys. And he shoots down 5 Japanese planes with a limited amount of bullets. He shoots them down in less than 4 minutes. And by the time he returns to the USS Lexington, more fighters, American fighters, were able to get up and defend the plane. If he didn't do that and fight those Japanese guys by himself, all the guys on the USS Lexington would have died because the Japanese would have sank the ship. So he saved everybody that was on that ship. Well, he became this huge hero across the country, and he gave us some good news right after Pearl Harbor. They had a huge parade for him. That parade was enormous, and that parade would be like a World Series parade or the Stanley Cup parade, right? It'd be an enormous party to celebrate him and the good news, right? So unfortunately, 18 months later, Butch was still flying in the South Pacific, and he was shot down by one of those Japanese Betties, and he died fighting in the South Pacific. So he is a great lesson, though. Before his death, obviously, he did the right thing, and he saved all those guys. Pretty amazing, right, that he had that choice to make, and he made the choice to save everybody. He did the right thing, and he was clearly standing on his own because there was nobody else up there to help him. So he, like I said, unfortunately died. So Butch's legacy, right, was huge. And so that's your second story, right? Now, the thing about those 2 stories is that EJ was Butch's dad. So EJ, the guy that turned in Al Capone to teach his kid the lesson to do the right thing, was Butch's father. And so Butch learned that lesson from his dad and then did the right thing just a few short years after his dad died, did the right thing to save all those guys on the USS Lexington. Another crazy part of this story is that EJ and Butch were both from St. Louis. That huge parade that EJ had was held in downtown St. Louis. That Butch had for his heroism during World War II was held in downtown St. Louis. So it was a lot like the Blue Stanley Cup parade that we saw last year. Also, Butch and EJ's last name is O'Hare. And Butch O'Hare is who O'Hare International Airport is named for in Chicago. And some people erroneously claim that Butch was from Chicago. He was not. He was from St. Louis, and the airport, or one of the airports in Chicago, is named after him. So there's your Friday speech or speeches. Do the right thing. Stand up for what you believe in, even if you're standing alone. And really, we should change that now to stand up for what you believe in, even if you're staying at home, because you should be staying at home and practicing social distancing if you have to go anywhere. Let's flatten the curve and get this thing over with as soon as we possibly can. Stand up for what you believe in, even if you're standing alone.